Hey, in this video I'm going to show you how to use an Active Directory server for authentication in your Svelte app. This whole app, including the code, will be available down below in the description as well. So we're starting off with an almost blank Svelte app. We've already run npm install to install the initial dependencies, and we borrowed the design of the main screen and the login screen from our basic database authentication app. Check out that video in the description below if you'd like to see how we created that. For our AD authentication to work, our app needs to have the Active Directory 2 npm package installed. The package does have a message that it's no longer being worked on, but it still works. We just need to run this command, and then also install the TypeScript support using @types/Active Directory 2. Then to store the session information, we need a database, so I'm going to use PostgreSQL and the PG npm package, but you can use any other database you'd like as well if you're more familiar with that. The installation for that is just npm install pg and npm install @types/pg if you're using TypeScript. In order to use these packages, I have some helper functions I've created in the past. We have a function for handling the AD things and one for handling the database. The Active Directory file imports our new package, gets some connection variables, which I'll show you in a bit. Then we have a function to connect to the AD server. We need to provide that a DN, hostname, and the login info. We also need to list what attributes we want returned. I just have a few basic ones for now, but you can add as many as you'd like to this list. Then it attempts to connect to our server using those settings, and we use that in the other functions below. Here we have a function to verify username and password is valid. We send the function the email and the password the user types in. We attempt to connect to the server, and then we return a promise that tries the built-in authenticate function. This function either returns an error or true or false if the auth was successful. The next function is for getting the user's info. We just need to send it an email. It'll temp the connection and then return a promise with the result of the built-in find user function. This function takes in a standard LDAP filter, and in our filter, we're looking for that user principal name, filtering by user objects only, and making sure the user is not disabled, which is what this long user account control value means. This will then return an error or the user object from AD. Moving on to the database helper function, this file imports our PG package and grabs some environmental variables from an env file I'll show you later. Then the main function this provides is running the query. The query function looks for an existing database connection, and if one isn't set up, it'll create one. Then it tries to run the actual query. This function wants a SQL statement, and then any parameters needed for a prepared statement. Remember, when running SQL commands, you always want to use prepared statements, and you never want to insert variables directly into the statement. This npm package, of course, has this built in, as you'll see later. Then we either return the query result or throw an error. There's also some more advanced functions below that are used to connect to the database and reuse the connection if needed, and all this is an example of something called a singleton pattern. Now let me show you where the database and AD connection information is stored. Here we have a .env file that contains all of our important environmental variables. This file typically contains sensitive passwords and stuff, so be aware of that. You'll notice it's grayed out in the file list, which just means that it's excluded from my Git upload. So you'll need to create this on your own if you plan on cloning this code from GitHub. So let's check out our existing login page next. Currently, it doesn't do anything. And here's what it looks like from our database auth video where we left off there. We do have the form set up to send submissions to a login action, but we don't have that action defined yet, so let's do that. To read the form submission, we just create a matching plus page server TS file under the same login directory. This file will have a function with the same name as the action. login. In this function, we can grab the form submission from the request parameter available to this function. The request object has a form data function that grabs all the submitted data. And then for that data, we can run a get function to read each input. The name we provide here has to match the input's name attribute back on the form. We then need to check if the input is valid. We don't want blank submissions, and we want to ignore attempts to reach this code that didn't actually come from the form. So if it's not what we expect, we'll throw an error. To throw an error in the form action function, we can use the built-in fail function that SvelteKit provides and provide a status code and any data we want to send back, like a message here. We look for this message back on our form here. Now let's work on the Active Directory part. We need to initialize our AD helper function, then call the isValid function, sending the email and password to it. That will return a true or false, or cause an error. And if it's false, we need to show the user a descriptive message using the fail function. If we get past that check, we can grab the user using the query user function. And then we need to take that AD object and convert it into a more usable object that we define. To define custom objects in your code, we can create interfaces. And you can define interfaces anywhere as long as they get exported. But for our example, we'll create an interfaces file right under the lib folder. In this file, we'll just list our properties that an AD user will have. These should match the attributes you choose in the AD helper function. And then we'll export it like so. And back in our server script, we'll create a new user, set it to that type, then spread the AD user into our new object. You can use the shortcut spread operator, which is the 3 dots, if you know for sure the properties in the new object match the existing one. Next, we'll save the session in our database so we can verify the user's cookie we're going to set. Our PostgreSQL database for this app is pretty simple. Here's the code that creates it. We have a data schema. We have an extension that allows us to generate UUIDs. We have a session table, and this table will store the session GUI ID, the AD user as a JSON object, and the date it should expire. Then the bottom part is just for setting the permissions for the tables. In our server script, we'll insert a new row into our session database using our PostgreSQL helper function. We'll store the AD user object as a JSON string so we can access the user's info without having to requery the AD server every time. Then we'll set an expiry date to 8 hours from now. Also notice we're using the $1 as a placeholder for our values, and those values get specified in the parameters of the query function. This again is an example of using prepared statements, which you should always do. Also notice with Postgres, we can return values from our insert statement, which is handy. We then check to make sure we got a result, and if so, we grab the returned GUI ID, and if not, we'll throw an error. Then finally, we can set the cookie on the user's browser. To use cookies, we need to add it to the parameters up in the top of our function. Then we can use the built-in set function, give it a unique name, set the value to be our session GUI ID, and give it a few options such as what page to use it on and how long it should last. And in order for our session variable to be accessible here, we needed to define it outside of this block of code like this. Then at the end, our function requires we return something, and we'll just return success true. Now if we run our app using npm run dev, we can attempt to log in and see if it works. You'll notice we aren't forced to log in yet. We'll work on that in a bit. But we can manually go to the login page and attempt to sign in using a real AD account. And as you can see, it worked. The script sent us back to the home page. If we open up our Dev Tools, we can see the cookie under the Application tab. Here we have the Svelte Login App cookie with a GUI ID and a future expiration date. And just to follow what happened during this, on our login page, we clicked the Submit button, which submitted our form. The form called the login action on the server. That action returned without an error, so we reached the type success status 200 part, and so we were sent to the home page here. Let's also test the error message while we're here. If we go back and try a bad login, we get a nice custom error message. This message is coming from this part of the if statement, where it's looking for an error and displaying a message. This error comes from the fail function we set, and here is that message we are seeing where it says your username or password isn't valid. The fancy error message you're seeing, we set up back in our basic database auth video. So check that video out if you'd like to see how that UI part was set up. You of course can do whatever you want though, such as just displaying a simple alert box instead. Now let's work on forcing a login if they aren't logged in. To do that, we'll create a file called hooks.server.ts in our src folder. This is a built-in file in Svelte, but it is optional. This file lets you interrupt each and every request made in your app. So we're going to use it to verify that someone is logged in for each request. And if they aren't, we'll send them to the login box instead. In this file, we'll specify the built-in handle function. And this function has access to the event that was requested and has a callback function for resolving or processing the event. And the basic function without any intervention looks something like this. But in between here, we want to check for a session cookie using the same name as when we created it. If one was found, then we check the database for that session and grab the AD user LDAP object from it. And we also want to make sure that it's not expired yet. If we found a valid session, we'll store the user's info in something called the events locals. This is an object that is available in every server request if you wanted to grab it. And we can use it to store the user so we can read their info whenever we need it. In order for the locals to accept our user object, we need to modify our app.d.ts file and specify its new contents with the user object. Then below all that, we'll check for a missing user, which would mean they aren't logged in. And we'll also make sure we're not currently on the login page to avoid a loop. And if those are true, we'll redirect the user to the login page. Now you can see if we delete our cookie back in our browser, then attempt to reach the home page, we will get sent back to the login. And if we log in, we are then able to reach the home page and stay there. The last thing we need to do is just add a logout button on this home page. So if we check out the code for that, I already have a spot in the top right of the nav bar to put it. Let's grab a logout icon from a site I like to use called Tabler. If we just search for the icon we want and go into the details of it, we can just copy the SVG code here. And then back in our code, we can paste it into a link that'll just send people to a new logout path we'll create. Also, just to show how to read the user's info, let's display their name next to the icon. To read the user's info, we first need to send that data to this page, and we do that in a matching plus page.server.ts file. In that file, we'll use the built-in load function. We'll grab the locals from the parameters and send the locals.user object back as a user object. Back in the main page, we access the return data using the Svelte 5 props rune. Or if you're using Svelte 4, it would just be export let data. And then once we have that, we can go down where we want that info displayed and just insert it using data.user.user principal name. Finally, let's make that login endpoint. We just create a folder with that name in routes and create a plus server TS file in there. This file will just be like an API endpoint. It'll look for GET requests to that path and then do something. And for our app, we'll use that to expire the session in the database. And then delete the cookie. Make sure here to use the same settings as you did when creating the cookie, otherwise it won't actually delete it. Then we just redirect them back to the login at the end. And here's the login fully working. You can log in with an AD account to a real server and log out. And here's an example of showing the logged in user's info displayed on the top as well, although for you guys it's blurred out. So if you have any questions about this video, please let me know down below, and thanks for watching.